but throughout the training, there's going to be real-time learning opportunities, active student responding. The trainers are going to use those ASRs in real time to help promote learning opportunities for everybody. Anything that you type into the Pear Deck is going to be de-identified, and Catherine and Stephanie will talk more about what that looks like for folks that are unfamiliar. Throughout the training, we ask that you keep your line muted. The trainers are also probably going to disable the video feed to lessen demands on bandwidth throughout the training session. Now, as it relates to breaks, there will be a couple that'll be programmed in. There's going to be one that'll be provided right around 10 a.m. and then another one at 11. Very important for everybody that's in this training session today, please refrain from sharing any protected health or personally identifiable information for people that you provide services to or that you've provided services to in the past, or anybody that you might provide services to in the future. So any discussions, whether they're orally or they're in the text in the chat, should contain only publicly shareable information. Our trainers are going to do a little bit more housekeeping at the beginning of the presentation about the Pear Deck and how to interact and such. I want to note that for anybody that would like a certificate of attendance, that can be provided. To obtain that, the trainers will announce to you at specific times during the training when you need to enter your name and your email address. So go ahead and do that when prompted to do so, and I will get you a certificate of attendance as quickly as possible after the conclusion of the training. Additionally, for this training, the department has partnered up with West Virginia University to provide continuing education units free of charge for 100 behavior analysts or assistant level behavior analysts. So anybody on the line that's a BCBAD, BCBA, or BCABA. Three important notes here. First, those continuing education units will be capped at 100 behavior analysts, board certified or licensed behavior analysts or assistant behavior analysts. Second, the Cs are going to be first come, first served based upon completion of a Qualtrics questionnaire that the training team is going to provide at the conclusion of the training. And lastly, just as it relates to that, there is not an option to purchase continuing education units for the training. So if you're a behavior analyst that's interested in those continuing education units, please go ahead and complete that Qualtrics questionnaire promptly at the conclusion of the training. Okay. I think it's time to introduce the speakers at this point. I feel like I should have this memorized, but I'm still needing to reference some notes here. This is the 5th time that I've gone through it, and I can't believe it's the last one, but without further ado, let me give the intros for Catherine Williams and Stephanie Jones. So Catherine Williams is a board certified behavior analyst, and she's going to earn her PhD in psychology with an emphasis in behavior analysis from West Virginia University in August 2021. She has primarily provided behavior analytics services for students and teachers in public schools to support the development of efficacious treatment plans for students who engage in disruptive behavior in special education or general education classrooms. In addition to her clinical work, she also conducts research to identify effective instructional practices across a wide range of laboratory and classroom settings, and has served as a guest reviewer and guest associate editor for several peer-reviewed journals. In July 2021, she will begin a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical/translation research at the Marcus Autism Center at Emory University. And Stephanie Jones is also a board certified behavior analyst with a PhD in psychology with an emphasis in behavior analysis from West Virginia University. She's worked with individuals with severe and disruptive behavior in residential, recreational, clinical, and educational settings. Her research focus is on identifying efficient and effective interventions for problematic behavior that are realistic for caregivers to implement. She does this by focusing on researching effects of incorrect implementation on common reinforcement-based procedures, ways to improve the quality of staff training, and the extent to which behavior support plans are likely to facilitate successful behavior change. She has served as a guest reviewer and guest associate editor for several peer-reviewed journals, and she will begin service as an assistant professor in the ABA graduate program at Salve Regina University in September 2021. Now, grand finale coming up, folks. Advanced Behavior Support Plan Development with Stephanie Jones and Catherine Williams.
Thanks so much, Nathan. So as Nathan mentioned, we're going to be using an interactive software called Pear Deck. I just put in the chat some more information about Pear Deck, but if you're able, you can open this up on a different browser on your computer. You can also open it up on a cell phone if you have one of those with you. Go to joinpd.com and then enter in this class code, CQFYQU. What's really great about Pear Deck, especially for the training we're going to provide today, is that a lot of what we're talking about is evaluating the quality of behavior support plans. So we're going to be presenting you with examples of behavior support plans and talking through with you through Pear Deck what is good and what is bad about these behavior support plans. So it's really essential for you to get the most bang from your buck for this training and for us to be able to interact with you, make sure we're on the same page, all that good stuff. Additionally, those pieces that Nathan mentioned where we're going to put ask for your name and email, those are going to be used to get the CEUs as well as the completion certificates. If you absolutely cannot access Pear Deck, we will have the chat available for you to use, but it's going to be much easier for us if you're able to put it in the Pear Deck. Okay. So I will go ahead and get started unless Catherine, you have anything to add? Okay, great. So this is Stephanie speaking, and I'm going to be walking you through just the beginning part of our training, and then Catherine and I will be kind of handing it on. So today we're going to talk about developing and evaluating high quality behavior support plans, which has to just be one of my absolute favorite areas of research and of teaching. So first, let's get started with our first area where this is going to help us develop your CEU certificates as well as your completion certificates. If you go ahead and access Pear Deck and put in what your name is. If you do your first and last name, that would be great. Additionally, it will not give you an option to submit, but we have it. If you put it in, we have it, so don't worry about it. Okay, I'm going to give about 10 more seconds on this. There will be more opportunities if you are having trouble logging in. Another thing to mention for how Catherine and I conduct these trainings is that whoever is speaking will not be monitoring the chat, and whoever is not speaking will be monitoring the chat. So if you would like to communicate something privately to one of the trainers, please do so to Catherine Williams. Okay, great. Looks like we have a few more, so just about one more second on this. And now I'm going to ask you for your email. I can see many of you are pros at Pear Deck now. I know I've said it a lot in these previous trainings, but we so appreciate you being willing to interact with us on this. Okay, about 10 more seconds on this one.
And this is Catherine. I'm just going to chime in real quick to add, and I don't know if Stephanie already said this, that you can also use Pear Deck on your phone or on your iPad or basically any device that has an internet browser. So if you are kind of listening to this remotely, know that you do have that option if you would like to use Pear Deck as well and participate that way.
Thank you, Catherine. And this is Stephanie again. I'm going to go ahead and move on. Another thing to mention here before we get started, as Nathan mentioned at the beginning, this is going to function as a BACB CEU for anyone with a BCBA, BCABA, or BCBA-D credential. So the reason that I want to stop and talk about this for a second is because when we're doing this, it has to be above and beyond the coursework that those folks received in their training. So that does mean we're going to assume some knowledge. We don't want to leave anybody behind. So please, if there is some knowledge that we're assuming that you have, we also know that everybody's training is super diverse. Please message Catherine or I, or go ahead and put the question in the chat so that we can make sure that we're all on the same page. And now I want to hear from you again, because I know many of us serve different roles when it comes to BSPs. So for example, my main role when it comes to BSPs at this point is supervising other people's development of BSPs and providing feedback. At one point, I was the person just implementing the BSPs that were handed to me from the BCBA as an RBT. And I just want to hear, what was your role? What are your current roles? What roles did you used to serve regarding BSPs? And this will help us as we move through the rest of the training, make sure that our examples are catered to best serve all of you. Okay, great. So I'm seeing a lot of really diverse roles. Many of you also have multiple roles when it comes to BSPs. Some of you implement, create, train staff, and complete integrity lists. I see a lot of folks on here saying that they engage in quality assurance practices. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is going to be relevant for all of those different roles, but is going to be directly framed as quality assurance and evaluating quality. The reason I say that it's going to be relevant, though, for all the different roles is because creating a BSP, training other people on a BSP, and even implementing a BSP, starting at the quality assurance piece, you have a better idea. Okay, is this complete? Is this likely to be successful, especially while you're writing this BSP? So thank you all for providing your roles in the Pear Deck. It's so helpful for us to know and to cater our examples. I also see some folks on here that are house managers, and I really appreciate that you're here, and I hope that this is useful for you. Please make sure that you pop questions in the chat. I do think that understanding what will facilitate behavior change in quality behavior support plans will be useful for you, but please let us know if there's ways we can cater more to you. So let me give you the big picture of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start by talking about essential components of behavior support plans. Luckily, there is some research to suggest what essential components of behavior support plans are. I will give a caveat about this research. Not a lot of it is empirical, meaning that they haven't done cause-effect relations for what needs to be in a behavior support plan to facilitate change. What we have are a lot of interventions that we know are effective from the behavior analytic literature and from other areas of literature, if you're also including speech language pathology or OT pieces in your behavior support plans, and you have those other professionals collaborating with you. But what we do have for the essential components literature are a lot of really smart people who got together and validated as much as they could some measures for, okay, this is what all these people who have been working in the field for a very long time think is essential. I'll talk to you a little bit more about what that means. And then we're going to go through a lot of examples of components of a BSP and talk about what is good and bad in those components. I find it the most helpful for learning how to make really strong BSPs to look at other BSPs, get those examples and non-examples, get my brain working for, okay, so I have to fit so much content into a document, and I want to make sure that this document is likely to be read, which means I can't have a small novel. I need to have something that is complete but also concise. And hopefully some of the examples we provide today will give you examples of how you can think about embedding these different essential components into sections that increase the user friendliness of your BSP. And then last, we're going to talk about data collection and problem solving. Data collection is challenging for a lot of people. And we want to start by saying that we know that, and that we have been in a lot of situations where data is really challenging to get. And we want to talk through some of the ways that we were able to problem solve this, and also hear from you for successful strategies that you've used for how to problem solving, getting data, and making sure that your BSP is working. So now to hop into the first topic, which is the essential components of behavior support plans. I want to start with just a broader question. Why does it matter if a BSP is high quality? Why are we spending 3 hours on this lovely Wednesday morning talking about this? Again, thank you all so much for putting your responses in the Pear Deck. It's so nice to hear from all of you. And I see here that many of you are saying it will result in better outcomes, right? So what we're talking about when we talk about resulting in better outcomes for BSP is successful behavior change, right? That hopefully generalizes across settings, maintains over time, all the things that we hope when we create these behavior support plans. A lot of you are also highlighting so that it can be implemented correctly. So sometimes we may have a really good idea of what to do. We may have a really strong plan based on a really strong FBA, But if we don't write it completely, concisely, and clearly, it may not be implemented correctly. And if it's not implemented correctly, I'm sure many of us know it's not going to end up being efficacious, even though you have such a beautiful plan and such a beautiful FBA. Socially significant change, absolutely. Better effectiveness. Yes, low quality BSPs could cause harm. Absolutely. And there's a lot of considerations when you're working through a BSP, including what interventions you select and pros and cons of those interventions, which we will go through today to some extent. So great points, everyone. So what makes a BSP high quality? There's a lot of adjectives you can probably think of when you think of a high quality BSP. What are some of those adjectives? What are some of the components that you would include to describe a high quality BSP? Easily understood, absolutely. Person-centered, great point. If you have a plan that is not individualized, we're no longer talking about a function-based behavior support plan. Making it individualized is what meets all the standards that we need to be meeting to make sure that we're providing quality services. Accurate information, absolutely. I love this comment. It is effective and easy to implement, yes. So that's kind of challenging depending on the problem and the setting that we're working in. But I love already have the focus on implementation is going to be so important for successful behavior change. Easy
This
to
is
read,
Catherine. I'm just going to chime in real quick, but one interesting theme that I'm seeing across all of these responses is they're talking about kind of two different aspects of the behavior plan. One is the content. So like, is the plan appropriate for that individual? Is it likely to result in success? And then the other is the usability of it. So given this plan that's likely to be successful, is it actually being implemented well? Is it realistic for that environment and all that stuff? And I think that's a theme you're going to see continue as we go through today, is that really there's two different aspects. It's how it's written and then also what's in it.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And this is Stephanie again. Thank you all so much for your wonderful answers. I also love another one, focusing on the person's strengths. Absolutely. Function-based, yes. Okay, so now I'm going to switch bases a little bit. We've been talking a little bit more abstractly. So this clear and concision, all those things that Catherine was just mentioning. And I want you to focus what components are actually going to go into your BSP. You can think of this as the section headers, some examples of components you may consider necessary to be included in a high quality BSP are the FBA data, some baseline data, clear description of teaching procedures. You may kind of get where I'm coming from. I love how many of you seem to be outlining it in the order that you would put it in a document. And that's another piece of what Catherine was talking about for that usability, right? Like making sure that this is outlined in a way that is logical to folks. So we have one, antecedent interventions, teaching interventions, consequence interventions, absolutely. Relevant history, FBA results. One of the things I'm noticing here too is that you guys are often putting many. So a behavior support plan, although it may be a little bit easier and more concise if we're able to say antecedent strategies, strategies for reinforcing replacement behavior, and consequence strategies, right? But what I see here is so much more than that. So many wonderful answers here about the number of things that we really need to know to facilitate successful change. So I'm going to spotlight one of these answers really quickly. Functional assessment data, preference assessments results, historical information, diagnoses, neuropsych medical needs, staff response. I'm assuming that's after the target behavior. What the target behavior is, replacement behavior, crisis management procedures, proactive strategies, reactive strategies. And all these things go by a lot of different names. But what I really love about this is that you can see there are so many numbers of things that need to be included. And one of the nice things about the organization that we're providing these trainings through, for the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Service Guidelines, they're starting to put some of this together for you. So there's a wonderful document that Nathan shared, and I think is up on a website, but I don't know if I have the link. Nathan, if you're able to pop that in, that'd be lovely. And I'm not going to go into detail about these minimum required content areas because there is a document that I believe that you have access to that goes into more information about this. But for the minimum required content areas for your organization, there are some standards, and these including demographic information, the history of the individual and the rationale for the plan, person-centered information, functional behavior assessment information, hypothesized functions, clearly outlined behaviors targeted for decrease, clearly outlined behaviors targeted for increase, antecedent interventions, consequence interventions, safety and crisis guidelines, plan for training, and appropriate signatures. And right, like I'm talking a mile a minute here to get through all these, because these plans end up being very beautiful, comprehensive documents if everything goes the way that we want them to go. And although these are a bit vague, the guidelines that are actually provided go into much more detail. So if you haven't checked those out, I do highly recommend that you do look at those. But there's more that you can access out there. And there are some published guidelines that can help you and serve almost as a procedural fidelity checklist when you go through behavior support plans. And those are what I'm going to talk to you about today. And what I love about published guidelines for behavior support plans is that not only can they assist in quality checking BSPs, they can also inform creation of a BSP. So sometimes when we sit in front of our giant lump of FBA data and we're thinking, okay, how do I move forward and make this feasible to implement, but make sure that it's likely to be successful? You can kind of feel, or I have at least felt in the past, like I'm drowning, right? There is so much that I have to write into this document and try to make sure that it's user-friendly. But having one of these with you and looking through these and having one that you can rely on can help you develop a pattern in creating your BSPs to make sure that you're including everything that is essential for successful behavior change. So I'm now going to just show you a few examples of some of these published guidelines and talk a little bit about the pros and cons of these guidelines. So first is the Behavior Support Plan Quality Evaluation Scoring Guide. This is probably the most heavily evaluated quality evaluation scoring guide. Some caveats about this is that it is, as a quality measure, heavily relies on successful identification of a function. So ideally through our FBA, we have really clear idea of function, but that's not always the case. We may have an undifferentiated functional behavior assessment. Still, from your functional behavior assessment, you should have ideas of triggers, possible reinforcers, all of those good things that should inform your BSP. But this is going to be a challenge if you want to use this alongside a BSP where you have not been able to, or along an FBA where you have not been able to find a clear function. Additionally, it was created for education environments. What I will say about this, there's a lot here that you can translate if you're not working in an education environment to other environments, but it was very much heavily designed for an education environment. The other piece that I want to talk about when we talk about these different quality measures is who they were created by and how they've been validated. So for this BSPQE, they were created by experts and validated by experts. So when we talk about validation, what we're really talking about is two people are rating a BAP or a BSP, excuse me. Are they agreeing on how successful this BSP may be? To my knowledge, but I would love to be wrong about this, so if I am, please pop something in the chat. They have yet to do an empirical evaluation of, are BSPs that are this complete likely to be the most successful? Okay. So our next quality measure, and this is a little bit different than the previous one because it hasn't been validated necessarily. But what you end up having in this article is a survey of BCBA. So they sent this out to a broad range of BCBAs, BCBADs, and they had 54 respondents who were practitioners, researchers, and administrators. And what they asked are, what are the essential components of a behavior support plan? In your practice, tell us what you found was absolutely necessary for successful behavior change in a behavior support plan. And if you haven't had a chance to read this article, I highly recommend that you read it. It has a lot of interesting information about how people rate things. So sometimes people would rate things as, this is absolutely essential to include in a behavior support plan. Or they would say, this is essential, but it doesn't go in a behavior support plan, right? Behavior support plan is not your only document that you have for an individual. So that's also another consideration. And then last but not least, we have the essential components of written behavior treatment plans. I really like this one because if you go to it, it has a little list, right? So you can go through the list and actually hit the check marks, which I find to be really helpful and user-friendly. This paper had a slightly different method of development. So for this paper, they surveyed editors of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis and Behavioral Interventions. They had 36 people respond to talk about what they thought was the most essential behavior support plan component. So as I kind of whipped through really quickly these 3 quality assurance measures, right? You can think of them as a few different ways, but essentially they talked to a lot of people, they did a lot of work, and this is what they said was essential. You can tell just by who I'm saying that they reached out to, that they're likely going to involve different components. And that's absolutely accurate. So we've put together kind of a summary of what all of them said were important, what 2 of them out of 3 of them said were important, and what 3 out of 3 said were important. So first I'm going to start by showing you all 3 sources. So every single one of the sources, the BSPQE, the Williams and Vollmer, and the Quigley paper, said that these things were essential, these 7 things. So a defined target response, I'm sure many of us are not surprised to see that on the top. Consequences for the target behavior. So how are you reacting when the target behavior occurs? A functional reinforcer for replacement behavior. So that one piece kind of includes a few different things. So it includes what is the functional reinforcer for the target behavior, and how are you putting that after the replacement behavior? And then we have teaching replacement behavior, assessment information. So this probably falls into your functional behavior assessment and your preference assessment, data collection procedures, and a defined replacement behavior. So this is not a complete VSP yet, right? All 3 of these sources agreed on these things, but this is not a complete VSP. So then we add in what 2 of the 3 sources considered essential, which we now have training implementers, crisis procedures, prevention procedures, obtained consent written into the document, a criteria for revision. Revision meaning not just this plan is not working, we need to change something, but also this plan is working, we can change something. Both of those things. Reinforcing replacement behavior and measurable objectives. And then for one of 3 sources, so at least one of the 3 sources that I've outlined has also included these pieces. Team communication, roles for progress monitoring. So who is actually doing what, and how are we talking about how things are going? And I'm sure for many of the settings that you work in, you think, yes, this is an absolutely essential piece. If we don't say who is doing what, we have kind of what people call diffusion of responsibility, right? Like, no, I thought that person was going to do that. I work in a team with 15 other people, right? Debriefing. So talking to someone, the individual who's receiving services after the behavior occurs, about why that behavior occurred, how they're feeling. Risks and benefits to the different pieces of the plan, the signature of the author, reliability checks. So those are for the data. So are the data that are being collected reliable, and do we have plans for checking on that? Treatment integrity checks. So are the procedures in the plan being implemented as designed? How the supports are supposed to be fated? Plans for generalization and maintenance, and then baseline data for the individual. So what surprises you about this? I'd love to hear from you all about what you found interesting.
This is Catherine. While people are entering answers to this question, we actually had one question in the chat that I think might be worth acknowledging aloud. Somebody asked if you could clarify a little bit on what you mean by obtained consent as being part of the behavior plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like we actually don't have a Pear Deck measure for this in 1 second. So I'm going to open up kind of a different Pear Deck look. And if you guys can go ahead and type in here what surprised you in the previous, it's not going to quite match the table, and I can bring the table back up, but I'd love to hear what surprised you. To answer, Kath or Nathan, did you have something you want to pop in?
I just wanted to note as it relates to informed consent, look at the Code of Virginia for one, and then for the other, please see the practice guidelines, and I'll cut and paste the information in there as it relates to informed consent, because there's pretty specifics on what that means. That's Virginia specific, but Stephanie and Catherine can talk generally just as it relates to best practice for informed consent. So I think we can kind of hit it from both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and
Great, thank
how informed consent, sorry, yeah, thanks, Nathan. And this is Catherine. How informed consent is mentioned in the BIP isn't necessarily a complete description of the consent process or how the consent was done. That will be outlined in your documentation, like Nathan mentioned. But what we mean when we're talking about it in terms of the BSP is some sort of mention in the BSP that consent was obtained, who it was obtained from, and on what date that consent was obtained. And that's just sort of as a note that that behavior plan has been seen by the appropriate people and that it has been approved by all of the involved parties. And it also kind of gives somebody, if they were to find a copy of the behavior plan on the street, a point of contact about who they might get in touch with if they see it and they're alarmed by something on it. Hopefully that's not happening. Hopefully that's not the case. But that way, if it is the case, all of the information is there in the plan about who to see about that information. I hope that answers your question, but feel free to throw something else in the chat if you want to follow up.
Great. So thank you all so much for asking the questions in the chat and for communicating in the Pear Deck. So I'm going to go ahead and pop some responses up to chat about. So the first one that someone said was that only one person thought baseline was necessary as well as signatures. Yeah, I'm also very surprised by that. So when we talk about baseline data and why or why not that may be important, partially, right, you're going to be evaluating the success of your plan based on the baseline data. So absolutely, I totally agree, as well as signatures. And then team communication, only one of three. For consistency, it would make sense that would appear higher on the list. I do wonder, right? So we're starting to talk about these different quality measures and how they don't line up, right? Aren't all the smart people supposed to get into a room and agree on what should go into a BSP? But unfortunately, that's not what we have. And I do wonder if sometimes the team communication, if we have a small team, that a BSP is being written for. Is that why people don't think that's essential? And unfortunately, when we look at these BSP quality measures, people don't actually report why they say what is or is not essential, nor do they report the setting that they work in. So across these different BSP measures, the only one that we actually know is geared toward educators was the BSPQE. Otherwise, all we know is that BCBAs or BCBADs filled out the survey. We don't know where they work. For all we know, everyone who filled it out works in a clinic. Everyone works in a group home. We just don't know. Team communication, absolutely. And that reliability and maintenance items are so low on the list. So this point highlights an interesting aspect of BSPs, where maybe the BSP is new, right? You're starting out the BSP, you're trying to put the fire out, which many of us are doing when we're first putting in a BSP. So we are just getting it out as quickly as we can, seeing how it works, and then going to add in those aspects later. But really, like this person says, a true test is this going to work long-term? Are we thinking about the end goal, which hopefully is that the BSP no longer needs to be in place? And then this last comment that I really appreciate. Does this follow the VA regs and all the points of the BACB checklist? So this is a really great point. And one thing that I want to highlight here is that most regulations for Virginia, for any other state that you work in, any other organization you work with, vary on a few different components. So what's really nice about the Virginia regulations that I've looked through is that they do align with many of the other components that are outlined in these essential components pieces. There are some in the Virginia that I think are probably specific to Virginia. And there are some in the quality guidelines that are specific probably to the contexts that those individuals worked in, such as the BSPQE, who exclusively wrote that for teachers. So what's really challenging when we start to go through these regulations is that they don't line up, right? You want something where everyone agrees, but unfortunately, we need to do more. We have to think a little bit differently. We can't exclusively rely on these quality guidelines to tell us how we need to proceed. So there's a few things that are important to do as you think about what's essential to include in your BSP and what's essential to tell other people to include when you're supervising these BSPs and trying to make sure that they are complete and that you're providing ethical supervision. The first is to consider the context of the BSP. So we talked about that for a second when we talked about team communication, right? Like, is it a small team? Do you need to think about team communication? Also, to strive for a BSP that's as complete as possible. And I know that's challenging, right? Because it's a lot of this. You want it to be as complete as possible, but you also don't want to put the implementer to sleep once you get through just the information about the FBA. The thing that I like to do to kind of balance this, depending on the setting that I'm working in, is have a complete BSP and then have a short checklist on the front. If you're a substitute teacher, if you're an alternate aide, here are the things you absolutely need to know before you work with this individual as a little checklist up front. And then ideally, they still read the whole thing, but many of us know that some people aren't given time to read the whole thing. They walk into a room and they say, you're working with this individual, go forth and work with the individual. And then they're handed a 30-page document. They're not able to actually read it all. And the last thing is to use quality recommendations as a guide. So these are not necessarily something that are hard and fast rules aside from your practice guidelines provided through your organization. Everything else is just something that can help you understand what is going to be important and what a lot of other people think are important. So what I really like to do when I write a BSP is I like to look over all the guidelines really quickly. Even look over this table, which will be made available once some people review it, and say like, okay, so this is what most people think are important. This is what some people think are important. And you know what? I think everything is important, right? I'm a BSP nerd. So of course I'm going to try to include everything that I possibly can include, but that might not be right for your setting. So all these things are important. And let's think a little bit more about when things are or are not essential. So when are crisis procedures essential? And this is a Pear Deck request. And one thing that I thought was really interesting that someone had said on a previous Pear Deck about what you thought were essential or what surprised you is that crisis procedures were often outlined in their organization's instructions. And that may be the case where you have specific crisis procedures that are organization-wide, so you don't necessarily need to include them in the BSP. But some things to think about there are you able and how are those crisis procedures individualized to the individual to provide the most support, the least intrusive reactive or consequence procedures, and the most safety for that specific individual. So we have some folks that are saying these are always essential. Crisis procedures are always essential. We have a lot of people who are saying that. Some people are saying severe behavior that has health and safety ramifications. That's when you need to outline your crisis procedures. And a lot of you are saying when there are safety issues in place. Yes, so this is one of those pieces for crisis procedures, which maybe they go in a different document, depending on your organization. Maybe they are too intrusive. You don't need crisis procedures, maybe for an individual who is target behavior is screaming. I know that screaming is a really, really unpleasant target behavior to work with. I've worked with many of folk who have had to wear earplugs during sessions, but that might not warrant a crisis procedure, and that may be considered too intrusive. There is more information in your guidelines about when and when not to include a crisis procedure. So please do make sure to attend to those. And of course,
This is Catherine. I do just want to note real quick that if there is any kind of reactive crisis procedure, it should be in the BSP. But what we're talking about here is how you make the decision about whether there should be a crisis procedure at all, not whether or not it should go in the BSP.
Thank you. Okay, this is Stephanie again. So great, thank you all for your answers. I love this comment too. Even for individuals that aren't violent, a crisis plan may be helpful because changing their life this much could cause distress. So it's possible that behavior gets a little bit worse before it gets better when you implement a BSP, and you want to make sure that people are prepared. So that's a really great point. Ideally, we do have enough preventive procedures in place where that wouldn't happen, but that's great. Okay, so when are details on the reinforcement schedule for alternative behavior essential? Yeah, so this one is a lot more clear, and everyone seems to agree always. If you are implementing a plan to decrease a target behavior, you need to have a plan for increasing an alternative behavior. And to successfully increase an alternative behavior, you need a reinforcement schedule for the alternative behavior clearly outlined. You may not say that it's a reinforcement schedule, right? So if we're writing this for individuals who don't have a history understanding what reinforcement schedules are, you may not say that. You may say every time an individual asks for a certain TV channel on, you change it to that TV channel. But that's a reinforcement schedule. We have the replacement behavior asking for a certain TV channel. And then we have the schedule, which each time that's a fixed ratio one schedule, right? So always for making sure that this is happening. This is how we make sure that we switch allocation from the target response to the alternative response. If we do not have a reinforcement schedule for alternative behavior, we're not going to switch allocation.
This is Catherine again. Stephanie, you just stumbled on a really great point, and I just want to reiterate it. And that's that even if we are really well-trained behavior analysts, as this group is, we don't necessarily need to write a behavior support plan in behavior analytic language. And it's all right to sort of be looser in the terms that you're using if it means that whoever's going to be using the plan is going to be able to follow it better. And we also often talk about our plans in written form, and there should always be a written form of a plan, but one resource that can also be really useful if you're going to have a wide range of people implementing this plan and may not have that much time to go through that behavior skills training with every single one, is to have a video model of what it looks like to implement portions of the plan, because seeing it is sometimes easier than having to read about it, especially if you're unfamiliar with reading the plans in general.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And now, with all your wonderful points, which I appreciate, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine to start to talk a little bit more about critiquing behavior support plan content.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. This is Catherine. So when we're talking about critiquing behavior support plan content, there's a couple of considerations we want to take into account. And sometimes, as we've mentioned before, these can be a little bit conflicting. So it's about finding the best possible combination of content for your plan that makes it complete, but still usable for whoever's going to be implementing the plan. Because it doesn't matter how brilliant your procedures are, if they aren't being done the way that they're written, then they aren't going to benefit the individual you're serving. So the first thing to consider is the language clear and concise? And so I just talked about this a little bit in my comments on that last question, but considering who your audience is, who's going to be using this plan and what language they're familiar with, not necessarily what language you're used to using. And so a lot of the times I like to inform the language that I use on my BSPs by the language that the person implementing the BSP used during our interviews and during the meetings I've had with them. If they use particular terms to refer to behavior, and those terms are appropriate, then I'm going to try and bring those into the BSP because I'm bringing their own language into the plan. And not only does that increase the chance that they're going to understand the plan, but it also reflects the fact that I am listening to them and that we're working on this as a team and may help with buy-in. So just kind of a throwback to some of the interviewing techniques that we talked about on Monday. And then another point to consider is based on information included in the BSP, could you implement the plan with fidelity? And so another throwback real quick to our behavior skills training, if you are here for that, but one way to test a task analysis, which you probably most BSPs are going to contain some task analyses in them as lists of procedures. If you give it to somebody blind who is unfamiliar with you, who is maybe has similar experience to whoever's going to be implementing the plan, could they do the procedures with fidelity without receiving much training or feedback? And of course, ideally, they have opportunities to practice, they have opportunities to receive feedback, and they have supervision, but that's not always possible. And we recognize that. So the more you can make the plan clear, but also concise, and so that somebody can follow it the first time they read it, the better. And using things like those video models can be another way to facilitate this quick transfer.
Yes, and just to hop in real quick there, this is Stephanie. Catherine's point about making sure it's written as a task analysis, that someone can pick it up and implement it, is such a great point, and one that I want to add a caveat to, right? So if you give someone a task analysis for completing a DRA intervention, and they've never done DRA before, it may not matter how great your task analysis is, you're going to need to provide training, as Catherine hinted at, right? So really when she's saying making sure that your task analysis is clear enough that someone can follow it, it's someone with the component skills necessary to follow it. So they've implemented a differential reinforcement of alternative behavior intervention before, this one's slightly modified, but they have the component skills necessary to implement it. Either way, you're going to want to do some training, but that's how you kind of hammer in on how to make your task analysis as clear as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. And there is, as you're writing behavior BSPs, if you're writing multiple BSPs for the same organization, you might consider using really parallel wording and structure across BSPs, if that's possible, because it's going to make it so that somebody who's been trained to implement one BSP will have an easier time learning to implement another BSP, because the documents are going to be similar. Even if the procedures are different, just having that parallel structure can facilitate the generalization of those skills. Some other things to consider are, what are the pros and cons of selected interventions? There's no such thing as a perfect BSP. No matter what we do, there's going to be some sacrifice and some benefit for those choices. And so one thing we're going to practice today, because I think personally it was the hardest skill for me to learn, is identifying what you're kind of sacrificing and being really explicit about where your priorities are and how your decision making on what to emphasize in that plan is in the best, is going to be best for the individual you're serving and is in their best nature. And then finally, also what essential components are included. And we've talked a lot about these essential components, but you note that they're the last thing on this list. And as Stephanie has brought up over and over again, the components are great guidelines, but because every environment is different and every organization is a little bit different, the exact components that are needed for your plan are going to be different. But considering those components as you're writing the plan, the ones in the published guidelines as well, are going to help kind of form your outline and kind of provide a mental checklist of things to consider and to make decisions about. So one nice thing to practice is to look over the components as you're working on the plan. And I actually will write out justifications for why I do or do not need that particular component. And that just is a way for me to keep myself on track, but also a way for me to sort of have a document to refer to my decision making that's the root of the plan. And it almost serves as like an outline when I start to revise the plan as well.
Absolutely. And this is just Stephanie hopping in real quick. When you think about disseminating the BSPs that you've written, you want to make sure that not only they're in line with your guidelines, but they're also in line with the published quality standards to some extent, as Catherine mentioned, or having a justification for why not. Unfortunately, some of us get into situations when we talk about severe and disruptive behavior where the situation may become contentious. And you've written your BSP the best that you possibly could, but people are still questioning why you've made the decisions that you've made. And making sure that you're in line with your organization standards and with the published standards is going to help to just make sure your BSP is as successful as it can be when you implement it, but B, protect you. Say, yes, I did the things that the experts in my field say I need to do. I have the individual's best interest at heart, and I did what I knew to do based on literature.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. So it's a little bit earlier than we typically do our first break, but we're about to transition into actually looking at a couple of examples of BSP portions. And so I'd rather do that all in one chunk. So we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and we'll see everybody back around 10:05, and we'll start looking at a lot of examples and ways to critique a BSP. So see you guys at 10:05.
Okay, hi everyone. It is 10:05, so I'm going to go ahead and jump back in. And this is Stephanie who's going to be talking through the next part. What I will say about this next section is that Catherine and I are going to kind of jump back and forth a little bit more than maybe we have in the previous trainings, and that it's very heavily set to interact with you. We're going to show you a fake behavior support plan that is kind of a combination of a bunch of behavior support plans that we've seen and worked with before for individuals, primarily in group homes is the focus of this. And what we're going to try to do, time permitting, which is a really hard thing to do, and we know this, is get through what is maybe or maybe not, depending on your opinion and your thoughts on this, a complete behavior support plan. And we're going to show you sections of the behavior support plan, ask you what you liked, what you didn't like, what essential components are included about these different sections, with the hope that this is kind of programming in some examples and non-examples of how maybe your BSPs could look, or how those that you're supervising's BSPs could look. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm going to introduce Guy. Guy is a 35-year-old male who lives in a residential setting. Guy has great receptive language skills and an excellent sense of humor. He most commonly communicates using modified sign language, but has been recently learning to use an iPad to request specific items or to clarify when his original request is not understood. Now, this is the background section of Guy's BSP. So although it's not described as like the title of it as an essential component, this is the different section headings that this individual used were for increasing readability. So you're going to notice that sometimes some of the multiple essential components may be combined into one section. Now I'm going to continue to read through it. Functional behavior assessment, FBA, conducted by Guy's previous behaviorist at his previous group home. So he's recently transitioned to a new group home. Using direct observation, suggested that Guy may aggress or destroy property to access items. Property destruction was not observed or reported by staff as new group home, so it's not addressed in this BSP. Observations at Guy's new setting suggest that Guy may aggress or be non-compliant to get attention, avoid work, and access items or specific areas. In particular, Guy has challenges when his BSP is not followed, which may be more likely when he is working with individuals who are not familiar with his BSP. Therefore, it is imperative for staff to review the BSP prior to working with Guy. So, what do you like about this section? What do you think are aspects of this section that you would provide positive feedback to your supervisees, or you'd give yourself a nice little pat on the back of, this is a good section? And as a reminder from our BST training, although sometimes we may be really focused on making sure that what needs to get done is done, and may thus lean a little bit more toward the side of corrective feedback, this focusing on what's positive about what people have created is also a really good skill to have, and increases the effectiveness of your supervision and how positive your supervision is considered. Great, so there's a lot of really great comments in here. And again, thank you all for communicating with us on the Pear Deck. So some of you have said, that you like the note about sense of humor and the description about how he communicates. Some of you have also said that the part of history is really nice. So we, in our experience, right, and we're going to temper this very heavily with this is our experience and we don't know necessarily if there's any data to support this. It's really nice to start with a positive in your behavior support plans. Some of you had talked about this a little bit in previous trainings with about how you frame things is really important. And we think starting with a positive statement about his skills and strengths in a behavior support plan is a really nice way to get started. I've read many a behavior support plan that start with Guy engages in a severe aggression, severe self-injury, and many different settings all the time. And when you think about starting reading that snippet versus his strengths and how that may affect his staff and those who are working with him with even just how they approach, right? You may be a lot more tentative approaching someone whose BSP starts that way versus highlighting the fact that joke around with Guy. He wants to laugh with you. So great point. Some comments on the fact that demographics and mode of communications are outlined. Great. Yes, a really great point here that it discusses function and how the function was identified. So what we know about the functional behavior assessment right now is that there was a previous one that used direct observation, and there was a new one that used direct observation. We don't really have much more information than that, but we do have an idea of how the FBA was completed. Great points. Okay, so now let's put our claws on. Or nope, not yet, sorry. What essential components are included in this section? So of what we've talked about previously, what are some of the components that are included that you can see?
And as you all are reading these sections, feel free to also answer these prompts with questions you may have about what is included. Like if you're not sure if it's good or bad, or you're kind of just thinking about it, throw that into the Pear Deck, or if you don't mind, throw it into the chat, and we can talk about that a little bit too, because sometimes it's not always black and white what is good and bad about these. We really would like to discuss sort of the gray area with you today.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, so there's some essential components that you guys are listing. So we have some demographics, description of the behavior. Many of you are saying, I need more demographics. This is not enough demographics for me. FBA information, hypothesized function of the behavior. Someone has said this even could be considered some antecedent strategies, right? So we have talking about the fact that his BSP needs to be followed and that he benefits from a nice structured setting. His communication style, great point. Okay. Thank you all for completing this. Now I'm going to go ahead. Oh, some of you are still typing. I'll give you some more time. Oh, we have a question. Was an FBA conducted at Guy's new residence? So what this may highlight, this question here, is that this isn't explained clearly enough, right? So in this, it says observations at Guy's new setting suggest that Guy may aggress or be non-compliant to get attention, avoid work, and access items or specific areas. But this does not explicitly say that a functional behavior assessment is conducted. So this is a really great point on a possible limitation of this piece. I think we can probably say for this BSP sake that the observations would constitute an FBA, just for the sake of moving forward to answer your question. A really great question.
This is Catherine, though, and I think that also leads to another missing component here, which I know we're not supposed to be critiquing that quite yet, but we don't know when these assessments were conducted. So not only do we not know if one was conducted at the new setting, but we also don't know if these are 10-year-old assessments.
Great point, Catherine. Thank you. Okay, so now let's get our claws that are hopefully not claws, right? So what are some areas of improvement for this section? Catherine already mentioned the fact that there are not dates for our functional behavior assessments. So maybe his first one was when he was 4, right? And additionally, someone else pointed out that it's not clearly outlined if the observations at Guy's new setting would actually constitute a functional behavior assessment. So already some areas of limitation here. And I know it's kind of hard to weed through these paragraphs really quickly in a training, but I always like to think about, okay, so if I'm getting a BSP in front of me and I'm providing feedback, what is the feedback I'm providing on this aspect of the BSP? And many of you are doing that so lovely in the Pear Deck. So some of you have said too loosely written. And that's interesting. If you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that, either in the Pear Deck or the chat, that would be lovely. But it may be that it's not technical enough. Maybe what you're thinking, there's some argument in the field about whether it should be more or less technical. Some of you had pointed out specific aspects of the language in here that you don't like. Someone said that they didn't like the last line, right? And some of this may be a little bit more stylistic, or, you know, is this an off-putting line? Is this unlikely to be implemented because of that's off-putting? Many of you are saying we want more person-centered info. So all we really know about Guy from this is that he has good receptive language skills, an excellent sense of humor, and a vague understanding of how he communicates. But we don't have a lot of information about what he likes and doesn't like, and also more clarity from his previous assessments. Yeah, so a lot of what y'all are putting on here could absolutely be helpful. And we also have a comment about how it could be broken down into more sections. And that is going to be something to refer to your guidelines about if it does have organization strategies for you, absolutely. But also it might be partially stylistic and depending on the organization that you're at. So the organization that we came from and one of the previous areas that we worked, it was very common to start with a background section that summarized general strengths, very short pieces about the functional behavior assessment, and other little tidbits. It was kind of, I don't want to call it like a fluff section, but it definitely involved more kind of vague language to get people started. And that was a stylistic thing about the organization that Catherine and I previously worked at. But I totally agree that this could just be broken down into different sections, right? So we can have an FBA section. We can have a mode of communication section, which could be alternative behaviors and the teaching strategies for those alternative behaviors. Great point.
This is Catherine. I also want to add that the BSP is one document to help support the individual, but it's not the only document. So refer to your guidelines about what other documents go along with the BSP, because some of these details may be more appropriate for those documents, such as if you're going to write an FBA report following an FBA, then you're going to have a lot greater detail about what that process looks like. But that's also a document that you can then refer to in your BSP. So say for more information on these assessments, see this FBA report written on thus and such date. And that can kind of refer to more detail, but also keep your BSP from being a novel.
Yes, great point, Catherine. Thank you. And this is Stephanie. And just to answer a question in the chat, which we can answer to some extent. Why is there a lecture at the end of this about not following the BSP? And yeah, that doesn't really fit into any of the essential components, right? Like we're not saying like also include a section in your BSP about how important it is to follow your BSP, because many of these BSPs in the settings that we work in are legally binding documents to some extent, right? That when these are written in, especially if we're talking about like including them in an IEP or something like that, these people need to be following these procedures. So it does make sense that maybe that's confusing. One of the things that I've done in some of the BSPs that I've written based on the setting that I've been working in and the implementers is highlighted how important consistent implementation is. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can highlight this, and it's not necessarily essential. It all depends on your context and the implementers that you have. But I've had a decent amount of folks that when the plan starts working, they drop it. They say, we have fixed the individual, right? Which is not how we want to approach these things. We want to slowly fade these things out. We want to have our revision criteria specifically followed. So one of the pieces that I sometimes add in is how we have information to suggest that not implementing this BSP as it's written is going to be challenging for the individual. Sometimes I even put data in there. So if I have data on days where it was implemented as it was designed, And then the next day it wasn't implemented as designed, and I have the rate of challenging behavior. I'll pop that graph in. And maybe that's because I'm a bit of a BSP nerd or a treatment integrity nerd. But those are some of the reasons that this may be added. Yes, so we don't have any information about his family, his leisure activities, absolutely. So, and that may be, right, because we're only showing you a small tidbit of this BSP, but it's nice that you're looking for those holes. It may be that those things are in a different section. So thank you all for your points here. Doesn't talk about expressive language to the extent that some would like. Okay, so now we have the second section of this BSP. And this includes the target behavior, the replacement behavior, and baseline. It maybe includes it in a format that is unfamiliar. So it's in a table where we have problem behavior as the heading of our first column, average problem behavior before the support plan, so our baseline data, as our second heading column, triggers, so maybe antecedent, as our third column, and replacement behavior is our last column. And then for aggression, we have as our heading to our second row, and then non-compliance is the heading to our third row. So this has a lot of information in it, and we want to know what you like about this section. And then if you want me to read so some of you like the table format. Clear presentation. And this kind of highlights here that there's a bunch of different ways that you can do your layout of these components of your BSP that may help or hinder the readability of your BSP, which may also depend on the organization that you're in. So some of the organizations that we've worked in have templates. And oftentimes these tables that we make do not fit into the templates, which may mean that going against that template is actually going to hurt the readability for the individuals who are used to working through the template. So everything in one place, people say that this is clear. We like that there is baseline data included. Awesome. Measurability. One comment on here that I really like is that you see that the aggression and non-compliance are measured using different dimensions of behavior. So we have count data for our aggression, about 18 instances per day. And then we have duration data for non-compliance. So you have an idea already, even though we're not in the data collection section, of how we have data collected on these things. And also that this individual was able to select the most sensitive form of data that they could for these different topographies of behavior. So rather than necessarily counting the episodes of non-compliance, which in this situation could have been one, right? A 218-minute long, but one episode of non-compliance. So great. Thank you all for your points here. So let's switch gears and think what could be improved about this section? What are we not told about? So some of you are saying the language. And I think that this is such a wonderful point about how specific some of these things may be to the organization that you work in. So one thing that I definitely think is a negative about this table and the talking about the behavior is that non-compliance isn't necessarily a word that we want to be using all the time. And it's also not really a behavior, right? Because if we think about the dead man's test, this is not going to pass the dead man's test. So this is definitely a negative to the contents of this behavior support plan. But unfortunately, I'm sure we've all been in situations, even though maybe this consultant was called in because of aggression, where we've had the stakeholders say, yes, aggression needs to be taken care of. but also non-compliance is a priority for us. And we need to make sure that this individual is successfully transitioning from different activities or settings. As we move through this behavior support plan, you're going to see that this individual's behavior support plan is largely catered toward helping him with transitions. So this individual would have challenges when asked to move from setting to setting, which may be why non-compliance is an important piece, because sometimes this individual may have been failing to transition in challenging settings, right? So if we're talking about from a community setting back to a group home, refusing to do that transition is going to be really challenging for the individuals providing services. Great point in the chat regarding looking for a setting event. So we have triggers, which may or may not be the motivating operation setting event antecedent, but adding more details about some broader environmental context that may influence the likelihood of problem behavior is a really great point. Great points, everyone. Thank you so much.
I see, this is Catherine. I see one more comment about a suggestion to include teaching strategies, reinforcement schedule, and who's going to be teaching it. And I really like this idea because those things should be aligned with these replacement behaviors, but it's not included here. And so I do think that's something to consider. I believe it's in a later section of the document, so we'll get there, but this is a place where you could add it. And that could be a really nice organizational strategy to then have it aligned with the replacement behavior.
Thank you, Catherine. And you are all putting in so many great points. And I wish that we had time to talk about each one. I also love the idea of using latency rather than duration of non-compliance, so latency to successful transitioning. Absolutely. Many of you had said that the definitions here aren't as clear as you'd like them, which we totally agree. Yes, looking for more triggers, thinking that this may look a little bit incomplete. Absolutely. Okay, thank you all so much. Again, I wish I had time to go through all of your responses because they're lovely, but I do not. So let's go ahead and transition to the next section. So how this was broken down is that this next session was a potential reward section. So what do you like about this potential reward section? And I'll read it aloud now. The behaviorist conducted a preference assessment to identify preferred activities that can be used as rewards. Based on results of the assessment, Guy seems to enjoy sorting silverware, sweeping a broom, and sorting laundry. However, Guy seems to only enjoy the activities for brief periods and will request a break from the activities if they exceed 5 minutes in duration. Guy may interact with these activities more when staff are engaged in the task with him. In addition to the items included in the preference assessment, Guy's staff suggests that preferred food, such as chips, coffee, time at Guy's brother's house, time with the group home's janitor, and watching videos of construction sites may also be good rewards for Guy. He also likes areas with a lot of people and areas where he can view large views. Oh, I love this first comment. They love that there are details and specifics, and they've used exclamation points, for which I totally agree. This is a really nice specific section. So if we're talking about what functions as a reinforcer, the things that function as a reinforcer are not always going to function as a reinforcer. So for example, I really enjoy hugs, but if I get a hug for more than 10 seconds, that's no longer going to be a reinforcer for me, right? That's too long of a hug. And this is a really nice piece of saying it matters how long you engage with this activity. And beyond that, there are more than just the duration. It's also, are there staff engaging with him during that activity? So sometimes you may complete a preference assessment, and during that preference assessment, you're interacting with the individual who you're providing services to. But is that how the reinforcers are going to be used naturalistically? Or are they going to be engaging with those reinforcers independently? And if so, you have a confound in your preference assessment, and you may not have actually identified a reinforcer. You may have identified what would be a reinforcer if staff attention were included with that. So yes, great point.
This is Catherine. Several of you guys have also mentioned how you like the variety of reinforcers included here. And I agree with you that that's a strength, and that's really something nice to include in a BSP, because if you know even if they're reinforcers that you don't intend to use as part of the plan, it's nice to know what options there are in case there's a day where perhaps attention of a particular type is not available. What could you provide to enrich that environment? Or if Guy comes in after having what seems like a rough day before, didn't sleep well at night, like what could you do to further enrich that environment above and beyond the daily recommendations of the BSP?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. I also love that some of you are putting little anecdotes in here that are de-identified, which I also appreciate. Very fun for us to read and have an idea of what is going on the same page. So someone put an anecdote in here just to share how they once had an individual who loved pretzels. Everybody reported that they loved pretzels, but when they tried to use pretzels as a reinforcer, the individual said, "That's not when we have pretzels. We have pretzels during staff. We do not have pretzels during work." So another wonderful anecdote about how context dependent reinforcers are and how including those details in your behavior support plan are so important. Great points, everyone. I also have someone who has written that it's well written, but it would be beneficial to know how to implement these reinforcers across different settings. So how are we going to have him sort silverware? Where is that going to occur? Which is a nice transition into telling us what could be improved about this section. So the same section, just want to hear more specifically your constructive criticism. So
Someone
folks
put
No,
this is Catherine. Some people put some improvements in the last section, so I thought I'd repeat them here because there were some really great ideas. And one of them was that it doesn't mention what assessments were used to identify these preferred tasks or like what the preference assessment was. And I agree that that may be some useful information, and especially if we're not sure whether it's going to function as a reinforcer. So like we just talked about, the pretzels outside of the context of snack are not a reinforcer. Knowing whether it was a preference assessment versus a reinforcer assessment may also be really informative here.
Yes, and many people are now, and this is Stephanie, many people are now echoing that they want to know what kind of assessment this is. And I'm thrilled to see that because assessments matter, right? The duration of access that they had during those assessments matter. Whether or not those are being frequently removed as a function of the assessment absolutely matters. I also love some comments on here about just like how readable this is. In our previous section, some people had said, this is readable, this is concise and clear. And now in our critique section, some people have said, that's not the case. This is too much language, this is too much text. And this once again just highlights how important it is to make sure that you're talking to your implementers about what is or is not going to work with them. So first priority is always, do these align with our regulations and practice guidelines of the organization? Second priority, is this a high quality BSP that is individualized for the individual that we're working with? Third priority is, are our implementers going to implement this? Are they going to think it's readable? Great point. A lot of people want more detail on this preference assessment. They would like the ranking, and they would like to know what reinforcers didn't work. So what did you include in this preference assessment that was not identified as reinforcer? More generalizable activities. So a lot of the activities and reinforcers here are very specific to a certain location. So more reinforcers that could be used in different settings would be helpful, absolutely. Oh, I love this. So when was the preference assessment conducted and what motivating operations were at play? So for example, had he just eaten? Because we don't really have a lot of food on here listed. We have some comment about preferred food being a possible reinforcer, but was not included in the preference assessment. So what were some other motivating operations that influenced his responding during that? Great point. Another comment about categorizing reinforcers. So what are reinforcers that you could immediately deliver? So if you're in kind of a sticky spot, and what are those that are delayed? Yeah, so thank you all for those of you who did respond. It looks like we're done typing. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next section. So this next section were goals and evaluations. So what do you like about this section? And I'll start by reading it. The first for your primary goal. Given a use of a visual schedule and access to preferred activities with staff after successful bus rides, Guy will be compliant when riding the bus to and from community activities for 18 out of 20 consecutive opportunities. And then under our primary goal, we have the evaluating procedure. Each opportunity, Guy's morning staff should communicate with Guy's afternoon staff and record the duration of non-compliance while Guy gets on or off the bus. These data will be recorded on a data sheet that will be used to track Guy's success. The data sheet will be reviewed each opportunity to ride a bus to identify any increasing trends in non-compliance during transportation. If clear increasing trends in non-compliance are visible upon inspection, Guy's team should meet and discuss possible modifications to the plan. And then the last section, titled Review of the Plan, reads, Guy's team will review this behavior support plan every 2 months, following its initial implementation to assess the success of the plan. If Guy has not met the goals listed above and is not making clear progress toward these goals, the team should consider possible modifications. If Guy has met the goals listed above, Guy's team should meet and discuss whether decreasing supports is appropriate. Team approval will be obtained, made before implementation of this plan and before modifications are made. So that was a lot of information. What do you like about what I said and what's presented on the side? See, many of you are typing. And please do let us know in the chat if we're giving you an appropriate amount of time to ingest this information, or if you'd like more time as we move through this. And although this is the goals and evaluation for this, specific hypothetical BSP, it's also really important, and I'm going to highlight again, to check your practice regulations about how frequently you need to be reviewing the plan, which I believe is at least once every month, and making sure that's explicit in your behavior support plan. So a lot of really great responses here. So one individual said they really like the headers, so that this is a well-structured area of the plan that increases readability, right? People like the measurable goal, that there is a mention of a procedure for collecting data, an idea of when to review the plan. One individual says that they like that some of the procedures are embedded in the goals. So we have an idea of what procedures are going to help us reach these goals. And although it is lengthy, it is clear and concise and complete. Great points. We already have some pieces of constructive criticism, which I appreciate, that this is not enough reviewing of the plan, that this should be reviewed at least monthly. Great points.
And this is Catherine, I want to add into that putting a minimum time to review is great, but reviewing plans even more often than that minimum required written in stone time is very welcome. In fact, I find daily or weekly check-ins about the progress of the plan often helps me catch implementation issues or kind of decreasing trends before they start to really show in dangerous and less reversible ways. So the more you can review your data, the better.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a lot of comments on that. And obviously that's also has to be limited by the resources that you have. But as stated, it's important that you adhere to your guidelines. I also really like this comment here that there is discussion between the morning and afternoon staff that's written into the plan. And I've had a lot of challenges getting morning and afternoon staff to communicate, right? When your clock is up, a lot of people are ready to hit the road, which is completely understandable. So sometimes what I've done to increase communication between morning and afternoon staff, if there's not actual time for them to communicate built into their schedule, which often there's not, is having just the data sheet as the form of communication with a little box with a little bit of description that they can include about how things went with some more qualitative information. So great points. Some of you are still typing and I really want to be able to see your responses. So I'm going to give you about 15 more seconds on this, and then we'll talk about some things that need to be improved. A lot of you are really happy with how measurable this goal is. Okay, great. Looks like everybody's done typing. So I'm gonna go ahead and let's talk about improvements for this section. Really wonderful thoughts already. So where's the goal for aggression? That was listed as a target behavior, but is not included as a goal. Really great comment. And again, wouldn't this be more important to focus on than hurting others? Really good question. And of course that, may depend on the topography of aggression and on what your stakeholders say is most important. But I would completely agree with you that if I got a referral for an individual who is aggressive and non-compliant, I would definitely be focusing on aggression. More specifics for collecting data. Absolutely. So although there is information here about a data sheet, and maybe that's going to be a separate document, explicitly outlining your data collection procedures in your VSP is extremely important. Changing the language. Compliant and non-compliant are really negatively balanced. Yeah. So although we may be thinking about, okay, how do we make sure that this individual is able to go and access his community activities, right? Because what we're talking about here is an individual whose challenging behavior may be preventing him from being able to engage in community activities that are valuable to him. But compliant is still not the right word for this. Yes. So thinking about how we can say this, that's going to be the most palatable for our implementers. And not only that, but frame us correctly, right? As we think about implementation, our language matters. Really great points. We need more information about what the target behavior actually looks like and how it's measured. Great points. How are staff communicating? Review it more often, absolutely. Safe riding on the bus, cooperation, very nice for different recommendations for how to use those terms. We need more specifics and a request for more concise worded goals. These are all really, really lovely points. And then someone else put in here that they're not clear how riding the bus functions. And I don't know at this point that this BSP has outlined that, nor if it will, I'm not entirely sure. But in the context of what we're talking about, A, that should be written more clearly. Why are we talking about riding the bus? But B, for the context of this, we're talking about necessary transport. So the target behavior for this individual is that this individual was frequently getting on the bus and refusing to get off as a challenging behavior. Okay, great points. It looks like we have no one else typing. Oh, one more person. Yeah, so it says monitoring should occur, but there's no outlined plan for monitoring. A location for the data sheets, absolutely. This may be one of those pieces that's really important depending on the context that you're in as well. So if this individual had a single implementer that passed along the data sheet for morning and afternoon, that may reduce the need. But overall, the more details that you can include in your BSP, the more likely it's going to be implemented with fidelity. So really great points. What does success look like? So long term, all we have the information for the primary goal is that he's compliant when riding the bus, but we still don't know what that actually means. So really great points. Okay, so now we're going to go to a section that this individual has labeled daily recommendations. And I went ahead and collapsed. I want to know on this one slide what you do like and what you don't like about the recommendations that are provided. And this was a section of the VSP labeled daily recommendations, where they had structure routines for Guy, maintain proximity to Guy, let Guy take breaks, and speak positively to Guy. So many of you have said this is vague. It does not appear to be person-centered. May be okay for simple reminders, but there's not enough details for what this actually means. So this is a section that I've seen in a lot of BSPs that looks as though individuals have identified some possible positive behavior support mechanisms that will support Guy across many contexts and have maybe listed these out, but maybe they're not super person-centered, maybe they're not super specific to Guy, and also they're not very easy to implement. So just for the first example, for structuring routines, I am someone who very much likes freedom in my environment. So like, I want to structure my routine when I wake up in the morning. I don't want to be told what I'm going to do for the entire week. And Catherine is the exact polar opposite of that, right? She has a calendar for every moment of every day, planned to a T what she's going to be doing. So if you're structuring for Catherine or I, what you do for Catherine might evoke problem behavior for me. And what you do for me will probably evoke problem behavior from Catherine. So making sure that these are clearly defined and explained what's valuable for them, although it's nice to have some short recommendations listed, making sure that these are individualized is going to be of the utmost importance, lest you accidentally implement a BSP that's actually harmful. So the bullets work well as some comments for positive, but we need more details. What is proximity? What is structure? Too vague. Likes the positive words. Really great comment.
This is
It seems that
Catherine.
Oh,
I'm going to chime in real quick because a lot of you guys are saying the same thing where this is really unclear and allows too much interpretation. And one of the things I really want to highlight about the danger of this unclarity is you can end up reinforcing problem behavior with these kinds of recommendations because it says, let Guy take breaks. Okay, well, if we have behavior that's maintained by escape and this recommendation is made without any other context, then it could mean that after problem behavior, Guy is getting breaks and not after appropriate requests for breaks or whatever alternative response that the plan may be. So really being careful with specifying the schedule here is a component many of you guys have mentioned, but I just wanted to reiterate that one.
That's great. Thank you, Catherine. So just highlighting, although we may see a lot of areas in plans that would look like the short bulleted list of recommendations, and you may think, you know, in concept, in theory, these things will be helpful. If they're not clearly outlined for the individual for whom the plan is created, they may end up not being helpful. So keeping these things in mind as you move forward and evaluate the SPs. So what about this section? This is a different daily recommendation section for Guy. How do we feel about this instead? And I'll go ahead and start reading it for daily recommendations. Guy has been largely successful during his day. His success is likely due to positive practices in place. These practices are listed below. Talk to or joke, ask Guy a question at least once every 5 minutes. Ask Guy if there's anything he wants at least every 5 minutes. He can communicate his wants using sign language, his iPad, or by showing you. Praise him for telling you what he wants. If possible, give him what he asks for. If not, tell him why not and let him know when it will be available. Right? So Guy can't necessarily always spend time at his brother's house. That's going to be pre-scheduled, right? So making sure that if he does ask for time at his brother's house, letting him know when that possible reinforcer is coming. Use visual schedules and frequent reminders to prepare Guy for transitions between activities and settings. Talk to Guy throughout transitions at least once every 15 seconds. Complete activities with Guy individually or in a small group setting and provide frequent opportunities for him to engage with activities in a manner that is appropriate for his skills. Provide frequent access to preferred items following appropriate task completion. So what do we like about this section? And you can say generally, or you could also say relative to the previous daily recommendation section that we showed you for Guy. So much more detailed, yes. Allows for some flexibility. Good examples of defined behaviors that you expect of staff. Much more detailed than the last version, maybe not as detailed as we'd still like, but much more detailed. One of the things that you've mentioned here also is that this appears more directly tied to the results of his functional behavior assessment that was previously mentioned. So as a reminder, I know it's been a while since we've been in that section, but there is a piece that said that based on observation in his new group home, challenging behavior seemed to be associated with access to attention, access to preferred items, and escape from tasks. So that does mean that his preventative procedures, which are outlined here in the daily recommendation section, need to be consistent with the functions that we've identified through his functional behavior assessment. We have some things listed here in the daily recommendations to try to make sure he's receiving attention, following appropriate behavior rather than challenging behavior, and generally throughout his day. To help structure his routine, which those predictable routines and those predictable events may serve to decrease the establishing operation of some of that escape maintain problem behavior. Absolutely. And making sure that access to preferred items is contingent on appropriate task completion. So working with the fact that he is motivated by access to items and that appropriate task completion needs a reinforcer. So yes, function-based here. And right, why are we doing an FBA if we don't use the results of an FBA to make sure that our BSP is as effective as possible? Great points. More detailed, more specific. And thank you all for responding in fairness. Okay, so it seems like everyone's done typing. I bet everyone's itching to get to the next one. What can we improve? But I love how everyone is finding something positive to say. Go ahead, Kat.
This is Catherine. Just while you guys are typing, I want to throw in one more benefit to being this detailed is if you think back to our behavior skills training and also to our introduction to BSP writing, one part of BSP is also monitoring progress in terms of how well it's being implemented. And by being this detailed about what the procedures should look like, you're really making your life easier when you're trying to make those integrity sheets, those task analyses, such that you can provide feedback on what components are not being implemented, because this is clear about what it should look like, or somewhat clear. You guys are finding some good flaws with it.
So really great comments here already about feasibility. How feasible are these daily recommendations actually for group homes? And that's a really great question. So adding in, making sure that he's checked in with every 5 minutes is going to be challenging, and making sure that he has someone to talk to him through transitions is also going to be really challenging. And of course, this is going to depend on the resources you have access to in your group home. But this also may need to be the focus of the fading procedure. So right now, where Guy is at, when we found him, he needs someone to talk him through transitions. But we acknowledge that this is not going to be appropriate long-term, and that we are using way more staff resources than is appropriate to make sure that he has the support. So focusing on, okay, so how do we fade this out as quickly as we can? Great points. Is there enough staff? Yes. Add more visual examples and schedules in here. Great points. Yes, the time frames of these reinforcers. So is this every transition? Is this forever? Absolutely. No clear reinforcement schedules on here, right? So provide frequent access to preferred items following appropriate task completion doesn't actually tell you how frequently that should occur. Is that after each task? Is that after each appropriate instance of work-related behavior, right? That's not clear. Great points. Yeah, and comments on here of, does he have a one-on-one? Do we know who is actually going to do these things? Because this could be a situation where no one's going to implement this because it's too resource intensive unless we make sure that the resources are in place to ensure accurate implementation to the extent of our abilities, right? Like in a perfect world, we make sure the resources are in place. Great points. No instructions for implementing the visual schedules. Adding timers for self-monitoring. Yeah, so trying to make sure that we're building in some independence for Guy. And what I really love about this is you're already getting to the thought of the next section, right? Where we're going to talk more specifically about pros and cons of interventions. So I see that some of you are still typing and I want to see what you have to say, but we do have to move on for the sake of time. So I'm going to wrap up really quickly with the last piece of content that we'll look at before we take our 11 o'clock break, so about 5 minutes. And these are the consequence interventions that were outlined in Guy's plan. And you can go ahead and say what you do and do not like about this section, just for the sake of time. And I'll read it aloud. So for what to do following challenging behavior with Guy, honor and so what to do with Guy, not necessarily after challenging behavior, is to honor any appropriate requests he makes that would normally be honored during that time. So for example, if he's in a negative situation where he's in the context of engaging in some of that non-compliant behavior that's been listed in the plan, and he asks for a bathroom trip, take him to the bathroom, right? Let him go to the restroom if he has the independent skills to do that by himself. Minimize the number of people in the room. If someone is not actively helping, they should wait in the hall. So you're starting to put together some of the things that are okay in this situation and that are not okay, which are listed under the do not section. So do not talk or negotiate during the crisis, except to repeat the demand. Change the demand in place or the choices available. Give him access to any food or items during the crisis. So that includes sensory items or weighted blankets, or bring people he prefers into the room during a crisis if they were not in the room before the crisis. So we have this do and do not section. Some people like the headers. More specifics though, right? This is not an extremely specific section. So if we're talking about following the consequence interventions, this is not a task analysis. We have an idea of general behaviors to avoid and to do, but we do not have a task analysis. So if we're thinking about how to monitor implementation, or that we can hand this plan over and say, okay, implement the plan, this section is not complete enough to help anyone immediately implement the plan. So what's nice is it does have some bit of flexibility built in, but it's also likely to be inconsistently implemented across implementers or situations. Some of you have commented on the language. So the do and do not being harsh. So can we think about a way to make that more palatable for our implementers? And then more comments on if this is realistic. So if we're talking about boarding a bus, are we able to actually control the environment? Great points. And then some comments about rationale. So why am I not doing these things? Why is it important for me to not talk with the individual during the crisis?
This is Catherine. I really like the point about rationale because I think one benefit of including rationale when you can is that you may result in generalization of the reason that procedure is there to other situations that might not be addressed in the BSP. Of course, we want our BSP to be as thorough as we can, but the world is crazy and there's always going to be situations that pop up. So if you say why they should or shouldn't do something in the plan, then when a new situation pops up, they may be able to make a pretty educated guess on what is the best way to respond.
Yes, great point, Catherine. And a really lovely point here as well as some of the ways that the headers may function negatively. And I think all of you just saw this in action. So Catherine actually wrote this section that I'm presenting right now. And when I started to read it, although I read it before, the first thing I started to do was read the sentences without the headers. So at a glance, I saw talk or negotiate with the individual during the crisis. Right? Even though that's under the do not header independently of at a glance, that may end up being contraindicated and making the interventions very confusing. Also, another person said this kind of prohibits person-centered terminology. So we don't actually know what this individual is doing, how he's able to advocate for himself here. All we really know is staff-centered language. Absolutely. And that additionally, this is pretty prohibitory. So if we're using these prohibitory interventions, we need to know why. We need to know that other things have been tried. Absolutely. I also like some comments on here that this is still attempting to be function-based, right? So escaping work after challenging behavior, accessing items, and accessing attention is going to increase challenging behavior. So although a lot of the settings that we work in, extinction is going to be really challenging, this is still an attempt to reduce the reinforcing aspects that sometimes follow challenging behavior. So we're trying to reduce attention during that challenging behavior and shift it to other times. We saw our preventive procedures. We're trying to avoid giving him preferred items after challenging behavior to the extent possible. And we're trying to make sure that if there is a demand in place, it stays in place to the extent possible. So keeping in mind that although extinction may not be feasible in all situations, in all forms, using aspects to reduce the reinforcing efficacy is important for challenging behavior. Okay, great. So I ran over a minute from when I promised you a break. So go ahead and put your name in. And then Catherine will pick up after the break and we'll think a little bit more about pros and cons of specific interventions rather than the specific clarity of sections of a BSP. So it'll be, we're going to leave Guy behind and focus on some new individuals and how we can support them using specific interventions. So just for everyone, as a reminder right now on the Pear Deck, please enter your name so that we can use these to develop your CEU certificates and your certificates of completion. I'm going to give you about 20 more seconds on this. Okay, great. Looks like everybody has typed. I'm going to go ahead. Ooh, one more. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and now put in your email address.
And once you're done entering your email address, you can go ahead and take a break and we'll see everybody at 11:12 to get through the very last section. And we'll leave this up during the break. And that way, if you need to run right now and want to come back and do your email address, that's also fine. For the last 30 or 40 minutes of this training today. So just as a quick review, we talked earlier about these essential quality components and questions to consider when writing BSPs. And I really want to highlight this third question because that's what our next couple of examples and non-examples are going to focus on, is what are the pros and cons of selected interventions? Now, I do want to give one caveat, and that is that the information I'm going to give you about these interventions is going to be limited because realistically, we can't read a whole bunch of BIPs during a training and then discuss it. As fun as that would be, there's just not the time to read a full BIP. So I'm going to give you the gist of a BSP, and then I'm going to discuss with you guys for kind of from that general perspective. But what I am about to show you are not procedures that are sufficiently clear and concise and that have sufficient detail for somebody to be able to implement. They're just for the sake of training and talking about plans at the larger picture. So that's my caveat real quick. So our first example here is Steve. And so in Steve's BSP, we have a typical background section with all of the relevant information we need. Then we have some information about the target responses, the FBA results, functions, the replacement behaviors. And what is generally communicated in this section is that Steve engages in self-injurious behavior, and there's sufficient evidence to support that self-injurious behavior is maintained by attention. And what is outlined in his plan as potential interventions are antecedent interventions, including morning and nighttime check-ins with staff, and 5 minutes without self-injury, there's a delivery of attention. So in this case, this is just the delivery of attention every 5 minutes without self-injury, so a DRO. And then there is also includes some measurement and data collection measures. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of those just because it's not the point of this example. And then a plan for training stakeholders and checking in on his progress throughout this. So based on this, albeit vague description of the components included in your plan, I would like you to comment on what you generally like about this approach, knowing what you know about Steve and knowing what you know about how these interventions are typically laid out. And if you feel like there's some essential information that you need in order to answer this question, also feel free to put some questions in and I can try and go into a little bit more detail about those components. So far, a lot of the responses here are mentioning that it seems like most of the essential sections of the BSP that we've discussed over and over again today are covered. And you're right, in general, we've got a lot of those essential components checked off here. Yeah, and that's what I see most responses are saying so far. There's still a couple typing. Some people are saying you like the conciseness of this outline, which I want to point out, this is not how I would ever write a BSP, but I do often write summaries of my BSPs for myself as kind of a way, just like this, as a way to look over all of the components I've included and sort of help find the nitty-gritty details that I may not have thought about, because sometimes when you're looking at all of the words and all of the descriptions, it's easy to lose that bird's eye view of what the procedures are and why they're there. So now that you've had some time to think about the good things about it, what are some ways that you would improve this plan? What is it missing? And what about these interventions and in general, these procedures seem like they're not there or are there or need to be changed? Yeah, so one is just more detail in general. And of course, they're going to be limited when we're looking at this outline, but especially when it comes to attention, what attention is occurring following self-injury and what attention is occurring following appropriate replacement behaviors. And that is not discussed here at all, actually. So there's no particular replacement behavior that's really mentioned here. And there's no mention of whether or not attention should be delivered followed self-injury. And so one thing to note is that although we have some really great antecedent strategies, and that these strategies here are likely to help decrease the motivation for that self-injury to occur, we don't have anything to guarantee that when self-injury does occur, it's not going to result in more attention than when self-injury doesn't occur. And so that is an important thing to lay out that's not discussed here at all, is what attention should or shouldn't be delivered follows self-injury, and what appropriate response could then be resulted in attention. Because here we're not requiring the individual to behave at all. We're just giving them attention following no self-injury. So this is also a differential reinforcement of other behavior procedure. But as several of you guys have mentioned in your comments, it seems like this might be a great situation to actually give him a way to recruit attention appropriately. So in that case, we would consider using a differential reinforcement of an alternative response or an alternative way to get attention. So you might teach him that if he wants attention, he can raise his hand, or he can flip a card over to green. And the next time that one of the staff members sees him, they come over and they give him attention. So an appropriate way to request that. And Stephanie, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to chime in a little?
Yes, I just want to hop in and speak briefly. What Catherine's saying about adding a replacement behavior, I think is so important. But I also really like to talk a little bit more about the dangers of DRO, which isn't necessarily that we talk about a lot because it is a reinforcement procedure. But using differential reinforcement of other behavior, especially as the primary intervention in your behavior support plan, is going to present with a lot of challenges. So for one thing, it's going to be challenging to implement because staff member need to continuously monitor the individual to see if the behavior occurs or does not occur. So that may make it prone to some treatment integrity failures that would decrease its overall efficacy. Another piece of this, though, is that depending on the rate of challenging behavior that this individual engages in, what DRO might turn into is extinction. So long periods of deprivation without access to attention, right? Because if this individual engages in self-injury once every 5 minutes, that may mean that attention never occurs, except maybe after the self-injury, depending on what the consequence strategies are, which we don't have listed yet. So relying on DRO as the main component of your behavior support plan is a really challenging thing to do. If you want to include DRO, add some more antecedent strategies and make sure that the individual has a replacement behavior. I know that sometimes when you're starting out the plan and the teaching procedures haven't taken hold yet, getting a replacement behavior going consistently is going to be challenging. And having another reinforcement criteria, such as the omission of the target behavior, may help increase that reinforcement rate. But again, if this behavior is happening consistently, it is going to end up being long states of deprivation. So make sure you have it programmed in there that the reinforcer is going to come, not just for periods of omission. So that's a bit of a soapbox that I like to hop on about DRO, but I wanted to just chat about that.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I think that is a great point about the different effects of DRO and DRA. And in general, DRA, when you're giving an individual an appropriate way to get what they want, that's always going to be a better option if it's feasible, because it's more likely to give them that way to get what they want in the real world or outside of the context of the individuals that are trained to implement their plan. One of the most common critiques that I see across many of these responses is that there really needs to be a crisis plan. There needs to be a consequence plan. And so I want to dig into that just briefly a little bit. So here are some of the strategies we have for Steve right now. We've got some antecedent strategies, but here in this left column, we have the current consequences for self-injury. And these are not specified in the BSP at all. And so therefore, these are the consequences that I imagine are likely to happen following self-injury when another response is not specified. So it might be like the quality of the consequence might be physical and vocal attention from staff, because staff are going to come over and likely block self-injury or help talk to each other or talk to that individual about what's going on. That's likely going to happen immediately, because self-injury, depending on the topography, can be really severe, and it's really important to step in. It's likely to last for longer in terms of the kind of attention than just walking by and saying hello, right? It's going to be more prolonged attention, even if it's going to be a different topography of attention. And the frequency is going to be consistent with that of SIB. So likely immediately on that fixed ratio 1 schedule, when SIB occurs, that response that includes some forms of attention is going to happen. So there's natural consequences here to SIB that are likely to result in some reinforcing efficacy. So one way that we can improve how the way that individuals respond to this SIB is by trying to decrease the quality of that attention that's delivered following SIB. So you might include this column on the right in your behavior service plan that specifies that if self-injury does occur, and this is that reactive procedure or crisis procedure that a lot of you guys mentioned is missing, that they need to maintain safety but minimize attention. So maybe avoid some form of eye contact, avoid talking about the behavior to the individual or to other staff members in front of that individual. Of course, you're still going to have to respond immediately, but try to extend the duration of attention following appropriate behavior or attention that's being delivered freely if you do still do that DRO, and decrease the amount of time as much as possible that attention is delivered during self-injury. And then also be as responsive to self-injury as you can while minimizing that attention throughout that procedure. So just including that in there helps shift the balance of behavior toward the positive, because you're decreasing the reinforcers to the extent possible following self-injury, which I included here because I think self-injury can be one of the really difficult behaviors to minimize the consequences for, because it is potentially so severe, so dangerous, and often results in very naturally occurring reinforcers. All right, and we're going to move on to our next example. This here is Wanda. And I know that this isn't a lot of information. A lot of you guys commented like, this is really difficult when we're not receiving a lot of details. But just think about it from the surface level, sort of overall, how is this structure going to help this individual, or what components are missing? So again, with Wanda, we have a nice and thorough background section. We know that her target response is refusing food, and that often results in escape to TB, meaning that she doesn't have to eat and she gets access to TB. And that the alternative response that's being taught is a vocal request for TV during mealtime. That's all we know. And then the antecedent strategies in place are a visual schedule reminder of when TV time occurs during the day, and giving her choices between mealtime or between meal items. So above and beyond what most of the residents of that particular location might receive, she gets some special choices, and they're really laid out for her so that she can decide her own diet. And then responses for food refusal include continuing to provide the food and prompt her to eat it, extend mealtime if needed. And then there's some information on measurement and data collection, and a plan for training the stakeholders and checking in on the progress. So based again on this quick overview of her plan, what do you think some strengths of this general approaches are?
And this is Stephanie just hopping in again, wanting to emphasize here that anytime that we provide you with an example of a hypothetical plan, we're doing this in the context that this behavior has been deemed problematic for their safety and for their health. So although people absolutely have the right to refuse food if they don't want to eat at that moment, this has been such a persistent problem for Wanda that her health and safety is compromised. So just wanted to pop in there.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, so a lot of you guys are noting how you like how there's an alternative behavior and how we're empowering her to make choices throughout the day as a way to sort of build up the reinforcing value of that mealtime, which I think are great components. And honestly, especially as you're working with adult clients that, well, really, it doesn't matter what individuals you're working with. The more you can incorporate choices to empower that individual to feel independent and to have control over their own situation, the better. That's just a really great detail to include. Most essential elements are included. Yes, actually, absolutely. There's proactive and choice measures given as well. Okay, now let's open the floodgates. What would you like to do to improve this BSP? What is missing, or what might be altered, or what could be strengthened about these procedures? Yeah, so I'm gonna start reviewing a couple ones, but please keep typing. One person asked, what happens if she does DRA? She appropriately asks for television and continues to not eat. So then she's potentially accessing one of the reinforcing components, and as well as being able to continue to escape, even though she's asking appropriately. And so, yeah, you're right. There's a lack of clarity about what that reactive procedure should be if she asks for TV but doesn't continue to eat. And that needs to be specified more. Yeah, and in general, a lot of these components are focused either on access to TV or escape, but don't really approach both of those. Yeah, there's a lot of lack of detail about how long the food should continue to be presented, how long should mealtime be extended. Yeah, so it's a little bit blurry about what these procedures should be. And overall, this DRA procedure, this alternative response, is not clear about how that should be reinforced, on what schedule that should be delivered, and under what situations that should or shouldn't delivered. So it's like there's a lot of pieces, a lot of really good pieces to this puzzle here, but it's not clear how they all fit together and how they interact and what that actual procedure looks like. And so as we are going through these, I think it's important to think about how the logistics. What does this actually look like in that environment? How can we incorporate TV during mealtime while ensuring that she's eating? Yes, absolutely.
Yes, and just Stephanie
Great.
hopping in really quickly. So many great thoughts here. And I also just love how everyone seems to be really looking for the most parsimonious option for trying to increase the success of this plan. So we have some people who have said in here, why can't she just watch TV while she eats, right? So if the act of eating itself is not aversive, and really it's the fact that she wants early access to TV time, how do we go ahead and program that within? And maybe she can ask for it at the beginning of mealtime so that she gets that independence and can recruit that reinforcer. But yes, at the end of the day, that may end up being easier. So I love that people are already thinking of, okay, well, here's an outside of the box way to think about how to increase the success of this plan.
Yeah, and I think that's a great suggestion too, because we're not removing anything from her environment, right? We're not restricting access to anything. We're not adding any aversive consequences. All we're adding in is more and a more enriched environment that might then help decrease the occurrence of this behavior, which is always a great way to go if you have that feasibility, and should always be your first thought if possible. So thank you all for your comments. I'm just going to lay out kind of a quick overview of some changes that we might consider for Wanda. So currently her plan looks something like this in that left column, where when she engages in this behavior, she gets an escape for food and no additional access to TV. And this is delivered immediately because she just stops eating, right? So we can't change that delay, and is potentially occurring for the remainder of mealtime and even extending how long she's spending during mealtime, which may prevent her access to other activities during the day, which is not great. And that may also prevent her access to TV. So there might be an extended time where when she's at meal even longer, she's getting even less TV. And as she's there even longer, she's losing even more. And that's not a good situation because we're restricting her access to something that she would usually get access to just so that she can eat. And so there's really no response laid out here for an appropriate request that would help combat with these naturally occurring reinforcers when she refuses food. So here's a potential new way that you might build in that consequence for that differential reinforcement. And when she appropriately asks for TV, or you might then allow for temporary access to the TV as long as she is eating, and kind of pair those two together. So when you eat, you get TV. When you get TV, you also eat. A minute or two to maybe set up the screen, but that's probably a consequence that can be delivered pretty immediately. And you might then give her a greater access to the preferred thing, which many of you guys mentioned. Why don't you have some TV available during lunch? And give her that time to access the TV during mealtime, as well as the usual TV time she has. And she can get that each time she asks, as long as that's feasible in her environment. So it's pretty easy to set this up in a way where it's going to compete with that extended meal time and not eating and potentially losing access to TV. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about one last component of BSPs that we haven't mentioned so far, and that is the aspect of data collection and problem solving. And this has been a theme throughout several of the lessons that we've given throughout the last couple of weeks, but I want to reiterate that a BSP is only as good as the data you have to base it on. And so if you're not getting data, as many of you guys have experienced, it can be really, really difficult to then be able to develop that BSP. And then it may also be difficult to know whether or not it's working, especially if you have that consultative role where you're only in the facility for a few hours, at most a week, and you're not able to be in there monitoring the progress all the time. Getting those data collected is really vital for being able to ensure the plan is working or problem solve if it isn't. And so remember that ultimately, no matter what you're doing, the goal of the BSP is to render itself unnecessary. If you have a really perfect BSP, then when you meet up to discuss progress, you're going to notice progress is looking great. And all you're going to do is start cutting small, intrusive aspects of the BSP to sort of fade the behavior that you have going into the natural environment and fade those reinforcers into the naturally occurring system that the behavior is occurring in. And so with that in mind, we need to have data in order to support whether or not we are moving appropriately toward this goal or whether we need to change something. And so data should be collected on several components of the plan whenever possible. And I'll mention all of the components, and then I'll also kind of give you a sense of priority. Like if you're only going to get data on 2 things, what would I recommend prioritizing? So great things to get data on are on the target behavior itself and how much it's occurring, on the alternative behaviors, because if you're using that differential reinforcement of an alternative response, but the alternative response is never occurring, then it may be a motivational issue. So there's no reason for that alternative to response to occur. Or it may be a skill issue that indicates that you need to revisit how that alternative response is being trained for that individual. Then you also really, it's nice to get data on staff implementation. And that's if it's appropriate and with explicit permission from that staff, right? Because if you're collecting data on an individual person's behavior, you should have permission from that person to collect those data. But these data can help you narrow down whether any issues you see with behavior are due to the plan or the way the plan is being implemented. Because if it's not being implemented how it's written, then it may just be that the plan is fine, but the components being left out are essential to the success of that individual. And so you need to do more training with the implementers to ensure that those components are included. But again, these data allow you to fade and to problem solve a little bit. But as we have all experienced, it can be really challenging to get those data collected when you're not there. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what reasons you think that individuals you've worked with have had issues or have been unable to provide data, and sort of what some of these boundaries have been in your experience. Yeah, so a couple of you guys are mentioning staff turnover. Absolutely. It's really challenging when you have people going in and out very often to have that consistent data collection system and to keep up with the training and ensure that as they're being trained to collect those data appropriately. Not enough time and conflicting priorities. Absolutely. Everybody that works in these settings has a million roles and is trying to do the best that they can for the individuals that they work with. And sometimes that means that they are just called to do way too many things and may not have the time or may not make the time to collect those data. So that's one important thing, is as you're introducing these data collection systems, sort of emphasizing why it's important to make this a priority. Even though it feels like it doesn't have any immediate effect on the individual, it feels kind of arbitrary to write something down on a piece of paper, how it has those long-term effects on that benefit of the individual. Yeah, and then there's also, many of you guys have mentioned logistical issues. So actually like getting the data sheet to the people who are going to be collecting data, knowing where to put those data sheets when they're done, all of these kind of systems that are involved in maintaining data collection. When you put it in an Excel sheet, when you're able to graph it, who's going to do that? And I think that is an aspect of data collection that we don't talk about enough, but really deserves almost a BSP of its own, right? Like it's nice to actually have a plan of what that looks like and whose responsibilities those are and what priorities they should have. So like this particular staff member should be in charge of putting in all of the data in the Excel sheet. And the only thing that should trump that time is if there is an individual that is, if there is a staff member who's out that day and they need to sub in for that staff member, but otherwise, like the data should be their priority at this time of day. So including something explicit like that in your environment can really help to overcome those logistical barriers. I also see a couple of people just saying it's too confusing. Like data collection is weird. And it's something that I think behavior analysts take for granted because in general, behavior analysts love data. That's one of our stereotypes. But that's not the case for everybody. Not everybody appreciates data, and not everybody may be familiar with how to read and interpret data that they collect or why it's important to collect that. So sort of working at that baseline education about what data are, how they're used, and why they're important can be really helpful too. So
Yeah, so just to hop in
you-
really quickly, sorry, Catherine, to interrupt you. This
No,
is something I also see on here, and I just can't stop plugging the use of one of these. I promise I don't have a sponsorship, but some of you had said it's challenging to bring data sheets with you. The behavior may be too high rate. They just may not have enough hands for it. So one of the things that I've used historically that has been extremely successful across a lot of different settings is getting clickers of some kind. So there's some that clip on your belt. There's some you can wear around your finger. There's some that are like a watch. And every time the staff notices that the behavior occurs, they click. And depending on how many clickers they have, right? Like you end up with a belt full of clickers, that's no longer helpful or easy. But depending on the number of clickers that people have, that may be helpful. The other thing that I want to highlight while we're talking about the challenges with data collection is that so many of you already in the Pear Deck have said, like, yes, I have encountered these challenges, but there are ways to overcome them. And that's what we're going to talk to you guys about in a second. All of us have heard these things. All of us have experienced these things in real time, right? Like we have probably been the staff. I have been the staff that has not enough hands to collect the data that I'm being asked to collect. So it's important that even though we know that there's these obstacles, that we also know that there are ways to change them. So sorry.
Well, you just provided the perfect transition to the next question, which is what are some strategies that you found that work for you in your environment to increase the data collection fidelity? So when you face these problems, how do you address them, or also how do you prevent them? And then we'll also provide some strategies that we found have worked for us.
Yes, and there was one on here that I was specifically referencing on the last period, where an individual put it in their standard notes. So the data collection is already a part of their standard notes, is something that they have to do as being part of that center. And this individual reports that it has really helped to increase data collection, and that you can see these changes occurring in real time.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really nice about that too is data collection, as we often do it, can feel really unsensitive and unindividualized, right? So you're just like marking a tally, for example, every time a behavior occurs. That feels very robotic and can make it feel like you're almost not looking at the individual's behavior so much as just looking at them like a computer or a system. And so one nice thing about incorporating this into your notes is it also increases the fact that we care about what this behavior looks like. We care about the situation that this is occurring, and we care about how the individual is responding and how this also makes staff feel and other things that you might be writing in your notes. But we also like to be able to graph things, and to do that and to make some database decisions, we need some numbers. So by putting those side by side, we increase, I think, the value of both of those kind of quantitative and qualitative measures. And also it's a lot easier to incorporate into the system. Stephanie, I see that you're highlighting a couple of our great responses.
Yes, and I was going to keep going through and doing that, but there's just so many great strategies on here that I wanted to pop a few up here. So the Search Fund Simpler data collection tool that's consistent with their daily notes, something that we kind of mentioned earlier, but also the data collection training. So having a short video that can be used during onboarding for new staff to let them know that this is an expectation as we move forward, and here's some training on it, is a really great strategy. I also really love this comment because it includes so many different strategies. So frequency data collection is not possible for everybody. So switching to partial interval, although it's much less sensitive than frequency data collection, may mean that you end up getting some data, right? And what we're talking about right now is we need some data. Ideally, you do frequency if possible, but partial interval is an alternative for ease of use. I also love including the provider as part of creating the data sheet to make sure that it's feasible for them. I used to make data sheets without talking to my provider, and I stopped after receiving a lot of punishment, right? That's what I will call what happened in that situation. And now using them collaboratively, making them feel like an agent, making them know that they are an agent of action in this data collection system, I found to be so successful. And also sharing graphs, providing reinforcement, assigning staff to collect data. I'm now realizing that we haven't even gotten to our strategies yet and we're low on time, so I'll stop doing this, but thank you all so much for your great points.
Well, honestly, it's great because a lot of the strategies you guys are mentioning are ones we're about to go over. So truly, we could probably just supplement our next slides with your comments. But here's a couple of strategies that we have found work for us. And in general, I will say that the people I have collecting my data are often individuals who have never collected data before, and also are not typically ones that value the way that we use numbers. And so that is kind of my perspective of where I'm coming from. So if you feel like, oh, like the people I work with may think that this is kind of like dumb, or I'm treating them like a kid because they already collect a lot of data, then ignore some of these strategies. So some nice things to do are to acknowledge the importance of data collection as the importance of the data collector. So I think it's so easy to be like, we use these data, they're so important, the data are useful, the data help contribute to the success of the individual providing services. But you can substitute that with you, and it's still all true. You are important in providing the correct services for this individual. Your effort that you put in on collecting data is important to developing the plan and monitoring the plan. The way you interact with this individual is what's driving their success. And so the more that I think we can attribute the behavior of the data collector to the data collector and not to the data, the better, because that's more familiar with how we talk to people that we value in general, and that can help build that rapport. Also, create the BSP and the data collection system in tandem. So you specify on your BSP what this data collection system is going to be, and your goals and probably your procedures are going to be based on that data collection system. If that collection system is not feasible in your environment, then your BSP is not going to be successful. And that's just, they go side by side. And so I think it's important to almost sometimes first talk about, okay, what data are feasible to collect in your environment? What can you fit into your schedule? And then work off of that to develop your procedures and your data collection and your goals. Yes, sometimes you may end up with data that are not as precise as if you could have the dream data collection system, but that's better than no data, which is often the alternative. If you have a data collection system that's not feasible for that environment, then you're not going to be able to make decisions based off of data because you have no data. And then also make the data sheet. And a lot of you guys suggested strategies for this in your comments, but make your data sheet friendly, as user-friendly as possible. And one strategy I found to help sort of guarantee that, because what's going to be user-friendly is really user-specific, is to work with that user in collaboration. If you have the time on making that data sheet, just bring your computer, sit side by side and talk through it. If you don't have that time, make them a couple choices. and then bring them in and like have them look over it, have them collect data using each of them for a day and give you some feedback about what they like and what they don't. You can make a hybrid data sheet that's perfect for them. And again, incorporating choice in everything we do is always a nice option.
And this is Stephanie just hopping in real quick. Sometimes I know that it's really hard to work collaboratively, as Catherine just mentioned, with your data collectors to make sure that the system works for them. So another way that I conceptualize user friendliness is how many steps are necessary. So like, let's find something quantifiable about how to talk about this being user friendly. How many steps does the data collector need to complete to be able to do this? And then also, how long does it take me to do this? So what I may do is ask a colleague to engage in the behaviors that I need to collect data on. And then I'll count how many steps am I doing to get this done? And how long did this take me? And then inform my decisions on the data sheet from there.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, this is Catherine. And I'm just one last point about data collection is as much as you can collaborate with the people who are going to be collecting those data in the creation of that data sheet. And again, be open to their suggestions. And when they hit problems or when they stop collecting data, which indicates that there's a problem, work with them on finding that solution if you can, because if they feel like they're going to be part of it and they're brainstorming, then they're more likely to use the product that you come up with. And so here's just some general ways to promote the implementation and maintenance of these plans and this data collection. First of all, use behavior skills training. If you want a nice overview of behavior skills training or a refresher, there's a video of that training from a couple weeks ago that we provided on specifically behavior skills training. Identify reinforcers for data collection. So remember, our data collectors are people, they're staff, they're people we want to work with. And as people, they are motivated by certain things. And so if you can find what it is in their environment that motivates them to collect data, then you can help to provide those consequences. So for some people, seeing a graph of performance is really, really reinforcing, and that's awesome. However, for some people, seeing a graph may feel very systematic, may feel very dry and unsensitive, and may actually decrease their motivation to include data. And so you might then do something like sharing thoughts and having kind of a catch up where you see how things are going or how they feel the individual is doing and what their progress is. So consider what's going to be reinforcing for the staff members you're working with. Also, check on data collection just like you would check on implementation of a behavior plan. You want to make sure that you are collecting the same data as the data collector in those settings. So sort of making sure that you align with there and what they're collecting data on will help you know how to interpret the data that are being collected. And then again, problem solve issues as they come up and do so collaboratively. The more you're able to work on data collection as a group, the more buy-in you're going to have about that system and the more input you're going to be that'll help make that system great. So that's a lot of information, but I hope this is some helpful tips and tricks for you guys. I went 1 minute over, I'm very sorry. But let's get your name and email one more time. And then at the very end, we will provide you a link. And if you want those CEUs, you'll have to click on that link and enter your information as well. So make sure that if you want CEUs that you hang around long enough for the link. And I promise we won't keep you too much longer. In the meantime, Nathan, did you want to chime in with any additional information?
Yes. First, just wow. What a fantastic training. Another fantastic training. 5 fantastic trainings in a row. I just wanted to take a second to thank Catherine and Stephanie for conducting these trainings for Virginia and just to recognize all the hard work that they put in to craft these trainings. They're not something that you can buy off the shelf. We had a lot of dialogue on what our needs are and where the services are going with therapeutic consultation, behavioral services in particular. So there was a lot of custom tailoring that was required that Catherine and Stephanie put in. And I think that they actually made it such that the training provided something for everybody, whether you're a behaviorist or you're somebody that works in some other type of various role in supporting people with developmental disabilities, or maybe even if there's family members on here. I'm not sure of all of the folks that are on here, but I do think that there's a takeaway for everybody based off of their experience and training level, as well as just the work that they're doing out in the field. So I just really want to thank Catherine and Stephanie for putting this training together. It was really exemplary. exciting to be a part of it, exciting for me to just sit here and soak up this information. And beyond that, want to extend gratitude to everybody that's here today and everybody that was on the previous trainings for your participation in the training sessions. We really had awesome turnout for these. And it's exciting when I look on here and I see 100, 115 people. I think we hit at least 100 for every single training that we did. So that was just really exciting for me. I also wanted to note, and I kind of alluded to this in the chat, but I do have the email address for everybody that completed this training, as well as all of the other trainings that happened prior. And I can send out an email blast to all of the attendees that contains the links to the recordings for this once these training sessions are made available, which hopefully we can make happen in the next couple of weeks. And additionally, if you included your information for a certificate of attendance from DBHDS, I should be able to get that information out to you within 1 week. Stephanie, Catherine, is there anything that you all want to add at this point?
I just
Thank
want to
you
say
so much.
thank you, yeah, for having us. This has been such a delightful experience, and I am just so, I think you guys have an awesome system, and I think it's amazing how much effort you're putting into educating and providing these opportunities to kind of further skills for everybody you work with, but also just the passion that I see both in your responses and also just in how open you are to thinking about things differently as we bring up other options or other ways. It's just amazing. And I think it just speaks to the quality of services you guys strive to provide.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk logistics for a second. The Pear Deck has now switched to email address. It seems like we're having a little bit of a lag, so we didn't announce that. But if you have not put your email address into Pear Deck, please do so now. Thank you all so much for putting your name in. And then I am going to pop up the link. And as I pop up the link, I'm going to put it in the chat. I'm also going to put up a slide that asks for your feedback. Catherine and I really like to improve the trainings that we provide. And although we won't be providing another one for you all, unfortunately, we are going to continue to provide trainings in the future and would love to learn from you all. We've already learned from you in your Pear Deck responses, but definitely would love your feedback. The other thing I want to mention when I popped in this link to the Qualtrics survey is that for us to be able to provide you with CEUs, you need to put your certificate number into the response that prompts you for your certificate number. Your certificate number is in your BACB gateway login, and it says certificate number and has hyphens in it. You also have an account number that starts with BACB. That is not the number that we need. We need the certificate number to be able to give you your CEU. Just wanted to make that really clear because some of you have put that in the last one. And I'll be trying to reach out to those of you who put in your account login number, but I want to make sure to try to avoid that.
And if you were here Monday and you put in, you're realizing now that you put in the wrong number, if you put in the right number today, we can also just match it with your name. So don't worry about reaching out to us if that's your case. Just make sure you enter the correct one today and we can match that for you, or otherwise we'll email you.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And then the Qualtrics link is now in the chat box. As a reminder, it is first come, first serve, but we don't have enough people in the training where anyone who would want to see you, everyone should be able to get it at this point, I believe. So please feel free to go ahead and fill out that link. Additionally, we had some comments in our feedback last time that you wished that we had given you our contact information. So as a reminder, the trainings will be made available after a review process. And that Nathan said will hopefully be in a few weeks. But if you do have specific questions for Catherine or I just put my email into the chat, stephanie.jones2@solvay.edu. And Catherine, I still don't have your stuff.
I will enter mine in a second. I'm responding to another comment.
Okay, great. And again, thank you all so much. The Qualtrics is up, and I'm going to go ahead and pop up our request for feedback. So what did you like about this training? What didn't you like? And I see that some of you are already responding with feedback. Thank you all so much. We can't really tell you how much we appreciate your feedback, but we very much do.
Stephanie, there's one question in the chat about where to find your certificate number. Could you address that real quick?
Yeah, so I just popped something into the chat I was working on for you. So the best I can give you right now is that it's in your VACP gateway and it's labeled cert number. It's formatted with 2 hyphens in it. So the number of X's that I've included here will depend on when you were certified. So when I was certified, this is what the numbers look like with those number of X's. And I'm sorry, I don't have a screenshot of where it is right now. It's also on your certificate, but that's where you can find it online.